The storm rolled across the city, pouring rain that blurred the streets with shimmering reflections of light. In the middle of a deserted road, a luxury car stood still, its engine silent, its headlights flickering against the downpour. Inside sat a billionaire, a man used to controlling every situation, yet now, drenched in frustration, he was powerless before a machine that refused to move. Marcus Hale had never known failure. At 35, he commanded an empire that stretched across continents. Steel, technology, real estate, his name appeared on buildings and in headlines. He'd built his fortune from the ground up, starting with a single construction contract he'd secured when he was barely 23, and expanding into a conglomerate that employed thousands across 12 different industries. His face graced magazine covers, his opinions shaped markets, his decisions affected the lives of countless people. Tonight, however, none of that mattered. His phone had died 20 minutes ago, leaving him stranded without the ability to call for help. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who could buy a fleet of cars couldn't get a single one to start. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel, the sound muffled by the thunder that rolled overhead. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and the street remained empty. Most people had the sense to stay indoors during weather like this. Marcus considered stepping out and walking, but he was miles from anywhere familiar, and his Italian leather shoes were hardly suited for trudging through flooded streets. He'd been returning from a business dinner across town, a tedious affair where he'd spent 3 hours listening to investors drone on about quarterly projections and market fluctuations. The food had been excellent, the wine even better, but the company had been tiresome. Now he was paying the price for taking the scenic route home, trying to clear his head before returning to his empty penthouse. Then, through the streaked windshield, he saw a figure approaching. At first, it was just a shadow moving through the rain, indistinct and wavering like a ghost in the downpour. As it drew closer, he realized it was a young woman, maybe in her mid-20s, wearing a worn jacket that clung to her frame from the downpour. She carried something in her hand, a toolbox, small and battered, the kind that had seen years of use and bore the scars of honest work. Her movements were purposeful, not the hurried shuffle of someone trying to escape the weather, but the steady gait of someone with a destination in mind, someone who had walked through worse storms than this. Marcus watched as she walked directly toward his car, not hurrying, not hesitating, as if she'd known exactly where she was going all along. She stopped beside his window and gestured for him to roll it down. He pressed the button, relieved when it still worked despite the dead engine. Cold rain immediately began to spray into the car, and he had to raise his voice to be heard over the downpour and the rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very air around them. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was steady, confident, cutting through the sound of the rain like a knife through butter. There was no uncertainty in her tone, no hesitation or doubt. She spoke like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, who had done this 100 times before and would do it 100 times again. Marcus studied her for a moment. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her in a way that should have made her uncomfortable, but didn't seem to faze her at all. But her eyes were clear and focused, sharp and intelligent. There was no trace of intimidation or uncertainty in her expression. She looked at him not with the deference he was used to from people who recognized his face from magazines and business sections, but with simple directness, as if he were just another person who needed help, no different from anyone else stranded in the rain. "My car broke down," he said, stating the obvious because he didn't know what else to say. "I don't suppose you know anything about engines." She smiled slightly, as if amused by something he didn't understand. a private joke playing behind her eyes. "I know a bit. Pop the hood." Marcus hesitated. The idea that this young woman, standing in the rain, with nothing but a small toolbox that looked like it had been salvaged from a junkyard, could fix what his expensive machinery had failed to do, seemed absurd. This car had cost more than most people earned in 5 years. It had been serviced by certified technicians at the dealership just last month, men in pristine uniforms who'd assured him everything was in perfect working order. But what choice did he have? He reached down and pulled the lever. The hood released with a click that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space of the car. She moved to the front of the car and lifted the hood, propping it open with practiced ease that spoke of years of experience. Marcus watched through the windshield as she leaned over the engine, unbothered by the rain that poured down on her, soaking her even more thoroughly than she already was. She set her toolbox on the edge of the car and pulled out a flashlight, shining it into the compartment. Her movements were methodical, systematic, the actions of someone who had done this 1,000 times before and could probably do it in her sleep. Minutes passed. Marcus found himself leaning forward, trying to see what she was doing, fascinated despite himself. She moved with purpose, her hands working quickly and efficiently, checking connections, testing components, following some internal diagnostic process that was invisible to him. At one point, she pulled out a wrench and adjusted something deep within the engine, her arm disappearing into the machinery up to her elbow. Then she straightened, wiped her hands on her jeans in a gesture so casual it seemed almost dismissive of the complexity of what she'd just done, and closed the hood with a solid thunk that echoed down the empty street. She returned to his window, her expression unreadable. Rain dripped from her chin and the tip of her nose, and her eyelashes were heavy with water, but she seemed completely unbothered by her bedraggled appearance. "Try it now," she said. Marcus turned the key, his heart sinking in anticipation of disappointment. For a moment, nothing happened, and he felt a familiar frustration rising in his chest. Then the engine roared to life, smooth and powerful, as if it had never failed, as if the last half hour had been nothing but a bad dream. He stared at the dashboard in disbelief, watching the gauges spring to life one by one, then looked up at the young woman standing beside his car, rain streaming down her face. "How did you do that?" he asked, genuinely amazed. He'd dealt with complex problems his entire career, negotiated billion-dollar deals, navigated corporate politics that would make lesser men weep, but this simple act of mechanical competence had left him stunned. "Your alternator belt was loose," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It wasn't charging the battery properly. Tightened it up, and you should be fine now. But you'll want to get it checked out soon. The belt's worn, probably been slipping for a while. You might not have noticed because these luxury cars have such large batteries that they can run for a while without a proper charge. But it's been degrading slowly. Another month or two, and it would have snapped completely. Probably would have left you stranded somewhere a lot less convenient than this." Marcus didn't know what to say. He'd owned this car for 2 years and had never had a single problem with it. The dealership had assured him it was maintenance-free, that he only needed to bring it in for scheduled services every 6 months. They'd charged him thousands of dollars for those services, given him glossy reports about the car's condition, and somehow missed this simple problem. Now, in the middle of a storm, a stranger had fixed it in minutes with nothing but a wrench and a flashlight, and more competence than an entire service department. "Thank you," he said, realizing how inadequate the words were, how insufficient they seemed for what she'd just done. "Can I give you something? Money? A ride somewhere? You must be freezing. At least let me pay you for your time." She shook her head, water flying from her hair in a spray that caught the light from his headlights.
"I'm fine. Just glad I could help. I was heading home anyway, and I'm already soaked, so a little more rain won't hurt. Besides, it's not like I did major surgery on your car. Took me maybe 5 minutes."
Marcus reached for his wallet, determined to give her something, but she held up a hand in a gesture that was gentle but firm. "Really, I don't need anything. Consider it a good deed for the day. My dad always taught me that if you can help someone and it doesn't cost you anything but a little time, you should do it. The world works better that way." She turned to leave, but Marcus couldn't let her walk away without knowing more. There was something about her, something that went beyond the simple fact that she'd helped him. An authenticity, a groundedness that he hadn't encountered in years. "Wait," he called out, louder than he intended, his voice cutting through the rain. "What's your name?" She glanced back, rainwater dripping from her hair, running in rivulets down her face and neck. "Emma," she said. "Emma Torres." "I'm Marcus," he replied. "Marcus Hale." If she recognized the name, she didn't show it. No widening of eyes, no sudden shift in demeanor, no calculation about how this encounter might benefit her. She simply nodded, gave him a small wave that was almost casual, and disappeared back into the rain, her figure fading until she was swallowed by the storm. He watched her go, feeling oddly bereft, as if something important had just slipped through his fingers, an opportunity he hadn't known he was looking for until it was walking away. Marcus sat there for a moment longer, the engine humming beneath him, the rain drumming on the roof of the car like 1,000 tiny fingers. Something about the encounter unsettled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Perhaps it was the ease with which she had solved his problem, or the fact that she had asked for nothing in return. In his world, everything had a price. Favors were currency, and everyone wanted something. People approached him with agendas, with proposals, with schemes to separate him from his money. Yet she had walked away without a second thought, without trying to leverage the situation for personal gain, without even accepting payment for services rendered. He drove home slowly, the rain still heavy, but the car running smoothly, better than it had in months if he was being honest with himself. The streets were nearly empty, just a few other vehicles and the occasional pedestrian hurrying through the downpour, heads down against the wind. When he arrived at his penthouse, a sprawling space on the top floor of one of the city's most exclusive buildings, he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the city. The lights sparkled in the rain, creating a tapestry of color against the darkness, each window a small story, each building a collection of lives he would never know. Somewhere out there, Emma Torres was probably back in whatever small corner of the world she called home, soaked to the bone and unbothered by the fact that she just helped one of the wealthiest men in the country. Did she even realize who he was? Did it matter to her? The next morning, Marcus found himself thinking about her again. He'd had a restless night, his mind replaying the encounter over and over, analyzing it the way he might analyze a business deal, looking for angles and motivations and finding none. The way she'd approached his car without hesitation, the confidence in her voice, the competence of her movements. She'd fixed his problem in minutes, something his wealth and connections couldn't have achieved in that moment. At breakfast, he brought it up with his assistant, a sharp, efficient woman named Laura, who had been with him for 8 years and handled most of his personal affairs with the discretion and efficiency that had made her invaluable. "I need you to find someone," he said, setting down his coffee cup on the marble countertop of his kitchen. "Her name is Emma Torres. She's a mechanic, or at least she knows her way around an engine. She helped me last night when my car broke down." Laura raised an eyebrow, but didn't question him. She was used to unusual requests, had learned long ago that her job was to fulfill them efficiently, not to understand them. "I'll see what I can find. Do you have any other information? Age, location, anything that might narrow the search?" "Mid-20s, probably. She was walking in the rain near the intersection of 5th and Maple. She had a toolbox with her, so she might work nearby. Local mechanic, I'd guess. She knew what she was doing, so she's been at it for a while.
"I'll have something for you by this afternoon," Laura said, making notes on her tablet with swift, practiced movements. By that afternoon, she had a file on his desk, thick and comprehensive in the way that only Laura's research could be. Marcus opened it eagerly, scanning the contents with an intensity he usually reserved for acquisition targets. Emma Torres, age 26, daughter of Rafael Torres, owner of a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of the city called Torres Auto Repair. She'd grown up working in the shop, learning from her father, and had a reputation in the neighborhood for being skilled and reliable. She'd graduated from a local high school with honors, had been offered a partial scholarship to study engineering at the state university, but had turned it down to stay and help her father run the garage after her mother's death. According to several testimonials Laura had dug up from online reviews and social media, she was one of the best mechanics in the area, with a particular talent for diagnosing problems quickly and a reputation for honest pricing that had earned her fierce loyalty from her customers. Marcus flipped through the file, studying a photo of her that Laura had pulled from social media. It was a candid shot, probably taken by a friend. She was standing in front of the garage, grease on her hands, a wrench in one, smiling at whoever was behind the camera. There was something about that smile, genuine, unguarded, full of joy, and completely unself-conscious, that made him pause. In his world, smiles were often calculated, strategic, deployed for maximum effect. This one was real, the smile of someone who loved what she did and didn't care who knew it. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair, his office suddenly feeling too large, too empty, too sterile. He told himself he was simply curious, that he wanted to thank her properly for what she'd done. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something about Emma Torres had gotten under his skin, and he needed to understand why. There was a quality to her, an authenticity that he hadn't encountered in years. Everyone in his life wanted something from him, needed something, expected something. She had wanted nothing. That simple fact was more intriguing than anything else.
The next day, Marcus did something he hadn't done in years. He drove himself, without a driver, without security, to the address listed in the file. Torres Auto Repair was tucked away in a part of the city he rarely visited, a neighborhood of small businesses and modest homes. The streets were narrower here, lined with family-owned restaurants advertising daily specials in hand-painted signs, corner stores with colorful awnings, laundromats where people sat on benches waiting for their clothes to dry. The garage itself was unassuming, a single-story building with a hand-painted sign that read Torres Auto Repair in bold letters, and below it, in smaller script, Honest Service since 1995. The lot was narrow, filled with cars in various states of repair, some on lifts, some waiting their turn. The paint on the building was faded, weathered by years of sun and rain, and the sign showed its age. But everything was clean and organized, tools neatly arranged, parts carefully labeled. He parked across the street and sat there for a moment, feeling oddly out of place in a way he hadn't felt since he was young and struggling. His car, sleek and expensive and utterly impractical for this neighborhood, stood out like a sore thumb among the older, more practical vehicles around him. A few people walking by glanced at it curiously, and he saw one teenage boy stop to admire it, pulling out his phone to take a picture, probably to show his friends. He considered turning around, driving back to his comfortable world where he knew the rules and his place in them. But before he could, he saw her. Emma stepped out of the garage, wiping her hands on a rag, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail that somehow managed to look both practical and appealing. She was wearing coveralls with the garage's logo on the chest, and even from a distance he could see grease stains on her clothes, on her hands, evidence of a morning spent working.
She was talking to an older man, her father, Marcus assumed, gesturing at something under the hood of a truck, explaining something with animated hand movements.
Marcus got out of the car and crossed the street, dodging a puddle left over from last night's rain. As he approached, Emma looked up, and for a moment, surprise flickered across her face, quickly followed by something that might have been pleasure or might have been wariness. He couldn't quite tell. She said something to her father, who turned to look at Marcus with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, the protective look of a father sizing up a stranger approaching his daughter. "Marcus," she said, clearly not expecting to see him again, her tone caught somewhere between surprise and amusement. "What are you doing here?" "Emma," he replied, suddenly feeling awkward in a way he hadn't felt in years, like a teenager working up the courage to ask someone to prom. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did the other night." She glanced at her father, who was still watching Marcus with a wary expression, his arms crossed over his chest, then back at Marcus. "You already thanked me," she said, "and I told you it was no big deal. Happens all the time. People break down, I help them out. That's what mechanics do." "Not really. I didn't even offer you a proper reward. I just drove off like an idiot. I told you I don't need anything." Her tone was patient but firm, as if she'd had this conversation many times before with people who couldn't accept help without trying to turn it into a transaction. Marcus smiled, trying a different approach. "How about lunch then? Just to say thanks. No strings attached. I promise I'm not some weird stalker. I just hate leaving debts unpaid, and you did me a real favor." Emma hesitated, and he could see the conflict in her eyes. She glanced at her father again, who gave her a slight nod, a small gesture that seemed to say it was her choice, but he'd be watching. Finally, she sighed. "Fine, but only because I haven't eaten yet today, and you're cutting into my lunch break. And I need to be back in an hour. We've got 3 more cars to finish before closing." They went to a small diner a few blocks away, a place called Rosa's that had probably been there for decades. The kind of place Marcus had never set foot in before, though he'd probably driven past places like it 1,000 times without really seeing them. The booths were worn, the vinyl cracked and patched with tape in places where the stuffing was trying to escape. The menu was laminated and slightly sticky, listing breakfast items alongside burgers and sandwiches and daily specials written in marker on a whiteboard behind the counter. The coffee came in thick ceramic mugs that had seen better days, the kind of mugs that were practically indestructible. But the place smelled amazing, like grilled onions and fresh bread and coffee that had been brewing all morning. The food was good, and the atmosphere was warm and unpretentious, filled with the chatter of regular customers and the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. The waitress greeted Emma by name and brought her a glass of water without being asked, asking about her father's health and whether the garage was staying busy. "So," Marcus said as they waited for their order, leaning back in the booth and trying to look casual, even though he felt anything but. "How did you learn to fix cars?" "My dad," Emma replied, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug, as if drawing warmth from it, even though the day was mild. "He's been running that garage for 30 years. Started it when he came to this country with almost nothing. Borrowed money from everyone he knew, worked 3 jobs to save up enough for the down payment on the building. I grew up there. My mom died when I was 6, cancer, so it was just the 2 of us after that. By the time I was 10, I could change oil and replace brake pads. By 15, I was rebuilding engines. It was either learn the trade or spend every afternoon alone at home, and I preferred being with my dad. Plus, I liked it. I liked understanding how things worked, liked the puzzle of figuring out what was wrong and how to fix it." "That's impressive," Marcus said, and he meant it. Most people he knew couldn't change a tire if their life depended on it. Hell, he couldn't change a tire, had never needed to learn, because there was always someone to do it for him. She shrugged, but he could see the pride in her eyes. It's just what I know. My dad always said that if you understand how something works, you can fix it. And if you can fix it, you never have to depend on anyone else. He taught me to be self-reliant, to not wait around for someone to rescue me. Said that was the most important thing he could teach me, more important than any fancy degree. That's a good philosophy, Marcus said thoughtfully, thinking about his own father, who taught him that the most important thing was to always be in control, to never show weakness, to never trust anyone completely. "What about you?" Emma asked, tilting her head and studying him with those sharp, intelligent eyes. "What do you do, besides drive expensive cars that break down in the rain?" Marcus laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised him. "I run a company," he said, deliberately vague, because he didn't want to change the dynamic between them. "We deal in a lot of different areas: construction, technology, investments, real estate development. Mostly, I spend my days in meetings, making decisions about things that seem important at the time, but probably won't matter in 100 years." She studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp and assessing. "You're Marcus Hale, aren't you? The billionaire. I looked you up after you left last night. Wanted to make sure you weren't some kind of serial killer or something. My dad's always telling me I'm too trusting, that I shouldn't just help random strangers in the middle of the night." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the worn vinyl creaking beneath him. "I prefer not to lead with that. People treat you differently when they know. Everything changes. Suddenly they're careful about what they say, how they act. Or they want something, always angling for a favor or an investment or an introduction. Why not? It's who you are." Emma's tone was curious, not judgmental, genuinely interested in understanding his perspective. "It's what I do," he corrected, leaning forward with an intensity that surprised him. "It's not who I am. When people know how much money I have, they see dollar signs instead of a person. Every conversation becomes a transaction. Every friendship feels conditional. I stopped making real friends years ago because I could never tell who actually liked me and who liked my bank account." Emma leaned back in her seat, a faint smile on her lips. "Fair enough, I can understand that. Though I've got the opposite problem. People take one look at me and assume I'm just some grease monkey who couldn't make it in the real world. Like what I do doesn't require intelligence or skill. Like it's something you do when you can't do anything else." "That's ridiculous," Marcus said immediately, with a vehemence that made her blink in surprise. "What you do requires real skill, real intelligence, diagnostic thinking, problem solving, understanding complex mechanical systems. Most of the people I work with, people with fancy degrees and expensive suits, couldn't diagnose a car problem if their life depended on it. They'd be helpless in any practical situation." "Try telling that to my high school guidance counselor," Emma said with a wry smile that held an edge of old bitterness. "She spent 4 years trying to convince me to go to college, said I was wasting my potential working in a garage. Like mechanical work is somehow less valuable than pushing papers in an office. She made me feel like I was disappointing everyone by choosing this path. Never mind that I love what I do, that I'm good at it, that it's honest work that helps people." Their food arrived, interrupting the conversation. The waitress set down plates with practiced efficiency, asked if they needed anything else, then disappeared back toward the kitchen. Marcus had ordered a simple burger, while Emma had gone for the daily special, a meatloaf sandwich that looked surprisingly good, served with fries that were clearly hand-cut and still steaming. They ate in companionable silence for a while. Marcus found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. There was no pretense with Emma, no need to impress or perform or maintain the carefully constructed image he showed the world. She treated him like a regular person, and he realized with a start how much he'd missed that, how exhausting it was to always be on, always performing. "So what made you stop?" Emma asked suddenly, setting down her sandwich and looking at him with genuine curiosity.
Last night, I mean. You were in the middle of nowhere, in a storm. Most people in your position would have just called a tow truck or something, would have had a dozen people scrambling to help you within minutes.
My phone was dead, Marcus admitted, feeling foolish even as he said it. And honestly, I wasn't thinking clearly. I was frustrated, angry at the situation. I'm not used to being helpless. I've spent my entire adult life making sure I'm never in a position where I need to rely on anyone else. It was a good reminder that control is an illusion.
Everyone's helpless sometimes, Emma said quietly, her voice taking on a philosophical tone. The trick is not letting it define you. My dad used to say that the measure of a person isn't whether they need help, it's what they do when help is offered, whether they accept it with grace or let pride get in the way.
Marcus looked at her, struck by the wisdom in her words. She was right, of course. He'd built his entire life around the idea of control, of never being at anyone's mercy. But control was an illusion, as last night had proven. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. Over the next few weeks, Marcus found excuses to visit the garage. Sometimes he brought coffee, picking up 2 cups from a nearby cafe called Santos Coffee that Emma had mentioned was her favorite, learning how she took it after the first visit. Other times, he simply stopped by to chat, timing his visits for Emma's lunch break or the slower afternoon hours when the morning rush was done, but the evening crowd hadn't arrived yet. Emma was initially wary, questioning his motives with the directness that seemed to characterize everything she did. But gradually, she warmed up to him. They talked about everything. Her childhood, growing up in the garage with a father who'd taught her that honest work was noble work, his struggles building his business from nothing while dealing with people who dismissed him because of his age and background, their views on life and success, and what really mattered in the end.
Marcus was fascinated by her perspective, shaped by struggle and hard work, yet full of optimism and resilience. She didn't complain about what she didn't have, never seemed envious of his wealth or bitter about the unfairness of life. Instead, she focused on what she could do, what she could build, how she could help others. She told him about the free oil changes she did for elderly customers on fixed incomes who couldn't afford regular maintenance, about teaching neighborhood kids basic car maintenance in the garage on Saturday mornings so they wouldn't get ripped off by unscrupulous mechanics, about the community garden she'd helped start in an empty lot down the street where people could grow vegetables. Emma, in turn, was surprised by Marcus's humility. She'd expected arrogance, entitlement, the attitude of someone who'd never been told no and didn't understand the meaning of the word struggle. Instead, she found a man who was genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, who listened more than he spoke, who admitted when he didn't know something instead of pretending to expertise he didn't possess. He asked her about engine designs and mechanical principles with the same intensity he probably brought to boardroom negotiations, taking notes in a small leather notebook he carried, following up with thoughtful questions that showed he was actually processing what she said. He talked about his own journey, the early years when he'd struggled, working construction jobs while building his first company, sleeping in his office because he couldn't afford an apartment, the sacrifices and compromises and difficult decisions that had brought him to where he was. One evening, after several weeks of these casual visits that had become the highlight of both their days, Marcus invited Emma to dinner at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, a place called Altitude that occupied the top floor of a downtown skyscraper. She was reluctant at first, protesting that she didn't have the right clothes, that she wouldn't fit in, that she'd embarrass him. But he insisted, promising her it would be worth it, that he wanted to share that part of his world with her, to show her something beautiful. When she arrived, wearing a simple black dress she'd borrowed from her friend Maria, who worked as a hotel receptionist and had better clothes for fancy occasions, Marcus was struck by how out of place she looked among the elegantly dressed patrons in their designer gowns and tailored suits. Yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. She walked through the restaurant with her head high, ignoring the curious looks from other diners, the whispers that followed in her wake from people wondering who she was and what she was doing there. "This place is ridiculous," Emma whispered, as they were seated at a table with a stunning view of the city's skyline, lights spreading out in all directions like a field of stars. "Do you eat here often?" "Not if I can help it," Marcus admitted, smiling at her honest reaction. "But I wanted to take you somewhere special. I wanted you to see this part of my life, even if it's not my favorite part." Emma glanced around, taking in the crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than a year of her salary, the white tablecloths that were changed after every seating, the waiters in tuxedos who moved with choreographed precision. The menu was in French, without prices listed, because if you had to ask, you probably shouldn't be there. "It's nice," she said diplomatically, clearly trying to be polite, "but honestly, I prefer the diner. At least there I know what I'm ordering and don't feel like I need a translation dictionary." Marcus laughed, the sound drawing disapproving glances from nearby tables where people were conducting business in hushed tones. "So do I. The food here is good, technically perfect, but it's more about the atmosphere, the exclusivity, the status. Half the people here are more interested in being seen than in actually enjoying their meal. It's all performance." "Then why come here?" Emma asked, genuinely curious. "Because sometimes it's expected," Marcus said with a shrug that held years of resignation. "Business dinners, important clients, investors who need to be impressed. It's all part of the game. You wine and dine them somewhere expensive, some are exclusive, and it makes them feel important, makes them more likely to sign the deal. It's ridiculous, but it works." "Sounds exhausting," Emma said, watching a couple at a nearby table who were barely speaking to each other, each focused on their phones instead of their companion. "It is," Marcus admitted, his voice quiet and honest. "More than you know. Sometimes I feel like I'm playing a character, like the real me got lost somewhere along the way, and this is just a performance I keep giving because everyone expects it." As the weeks turned into months, their friendship deepened into something more, something neither of them had quite expected or planned. Marcus found himself thinking about Emma constantly, drawn to her strength, her honesty, her refusal to be impressed by his wealth or intimidated by his status. She challenged him in ways no one else did, forcing him to see the world through her eyes, to question assumptions he'd held for years, to confront uncomfortable truths about the life she'd built. She made him want to be better, to use his resources for more than just accumulating more wealth, to remember why he'd started all this in the first place. Emma, for her part, was equally conflicted. She'd never imagined herself with someone like Marcus, a man whose world was so different from hers that they might as well have come from different planets. She'd grown up believing that wealthy people were fundamentally different, that they couldn't understand the struggles of ordinary people, that they lived in a bubble so removed from reality that there was no way to truly connect with them. But Marcus was proving her wrong at every turn. He didn't just listen to her stories about struggling to pay bills or helping her father keep the garage afloat during slow months. He was genuinely affected by them. He'd started quietly donating to neighborhood causes, funding a scholarship program at her old high school that would help students like her who had potential but no resources, supporting the community center where she volunteered on weekends, teaching basic car maintenance to single mothers who needed to save money. Yet she couldn't deny the connection between them, the way he made her feel seen and valued in a way she'd never experienced before. With Marcus, she wasn't just the mechanic's daughter, the girl who'd chosen Greece over college, the one who'd never amount to much according to her guidance counselor. She was Emma, with her own thoughts and dreams and worth, someone whose opinions mattered, whose insights were valuable, whose perspective was unique and important. One night, as they sat on the roof of Marcus's penthouse, looking out over the city, the lights stretching endlessly in every direction like a galaxy laid out before them, Emma turned to him. The skyline stretched before them, a sea of lights against the darkness, each one representing lives and dreams and struggles. A cool breeze moved across the rooftop, carrying with it the distant sounds of traffic and life far below. Why me, Marcus? You could have anyone. Models, actresses, heiresses, women who know your world and fit into it perfectly. Why are you wasting your time with a mechanic from the wrong side of town? Marcus looked at her, his expression serious, more serious than she'd ever seen him. Because you're the first person in a long time who's treated me like a human being. Because you don't want anything from me except my company. Because when I'm with you, I feel like myself again. Not Marcus Hale, the billionaire, not the CEO, not the guy everyone's trying to get something from, not the face on magazine covers. Just Marcus. The person I was before all of this, before the money changed everything. Emma's eyes glistened, and she looked away, blinking rapidly against tears she didn't want him to see. I don't fit into your world, Marcus. I don't know which fork to use at fancy dinners. I can't make small talk about stock portfolios or vacation homes in the Hamptons. I don't know the difference between good wine and cheap wine. I'm just a girl who fixes cars and gets grease under her fingernails and wears the same jeans 3 days in a row because I only own 2 pairs. Then I'll fit into yours, he said simply, taking her hand in his, feeling the calluses on her palms, the evidence of hard work that made her who she was. I don't care about any of that superficial stuff. I never did, really. That's just the costume I have to wear to play the part everyone expects. I care about you, about who you are, what you believe in, how you see the world. You make me remember what matters. You make me want to be the person I was supposed to be before I got caught up in all of this. She turned back to him, searching his face for any hint of doubt, any sign that this was temporary, that he'd wake up one day and realize what a mistake he'd made. When she found none, when she saw only sincerity and vulnerability and something that looked a lot like love, she leaned in and kissed him. It was a soft, tentative kiss at first, full of uncertainty and hope and fear. Marcus pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened, becoming more confident, more certain, more real than anything either of them had felt in years. From that moment on, they were inseparable. Marcus introduced Emma to his world, but he also made a genuine effort to be part of hers. He spent weekends at the garage, learning to work on cars alongside her father, who eventually warmed up to him. Rafael Torres was a proud man, suspicious of this wealthy outsider courting his daughter, protective in the way that only fathers can be. But he respected hard work, valued it above almost everything else. When he saw Marcus willing to get his hands dirty, to take instruction without complaint, to treat the work with respect instead of condescension, to show up on time and stay late and genuinely try to learn, his attitude began to shift. He started to see that maybe this man was serious about his daughter, that maybe the money didn't define him the way Raphael had feared it would. Emma, in turn, attended events with Marcus, navigating his world with grace and confidence, even when others looked down on her with barely concealed disdain. She learned which fork to use through careful observation, how to make polite conversation without revealing how boring she found most of it, when to smile and nod, and when to speak up. But she never lost herself in the process. She remained Emma, direct and honest, calling out pretension when she saw it, refusing to play the games that everyone else seemed to take for granted. At a charity gala, when a prominent businesswoman made a snide comment about blue-collar workers being the reason the country was falling behind, Emma politely but firmly challenged her, pointing out that without skilled tradespeople, none of the infrastructure they all depended on would exist. The woman had been flustered, unprepared for pushback, and several people had overheard the exchange. Marcus had been so proud he could barely contain himself. But their relationship wasn't without challenges. Marcus's business associates were skeptical of Emma, seeing her as an opportunist, a gold digger who'd manipulated her way into his life with some carefully calculated performance. They whispered behind his back at board meetings, questioning his judgment, warning him that he was being played, that she'd take him for everything he had and disappear. Some were more direct, pulling him aside at events to express their concerns in ways they thought were helpful, but were really just insulting. Emma's friends and neighbors whispered that she'd sold out, trading her values for luxury, abandoning her roots for penthouses and private parties, forgetting where she came from. They'd see her arrive at the garage in Marcus's car and exchange knowing looks that hurt more than any words could. The scrutiny was relentless from both sides, and there were times when both of them questioned whether they could make it work, whether the gulf between their worlds was just too wide to bridge. One evening, after a particularly difficult charity gala where several of Marcus's colleagues had been openly dismissive of Emma, making snide comments within her hearing about gold diggers and social climbers, they returned to his penthouse in silence. The tension in the car had been thick enough to cut with a knife, neither of them knowing what to say. Emma stood by the window, her arms crossed defensively, her expression distant. She'd changed out of the designer gown Marcus had bought her, a beautiful thing that had cost more than she made in a month, and was back in jeans and a simple shirt, looking more like herself, but also somehow smaller, diminished. "Maybe they're right," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we're too different. Maybe I'm just fooling myself thinking this can work. Maybe you'll wake up one day and realize that you deserve someone from your own world, someone who fits, someone who doesn't embarrass you at fancy parties." Marcus walked over to her and placed his hands on her shoulders, turning her to face him with gentle insistence. "Look at me, Emma." She turned, her eyes filled with doubt, with hurt from the evening slights, with fear that he might agree with her. "I don't care what they think," Marcus said firmly, his voice strong and certain. "I don't care about their opinions, or their approval, or their whispered warnings. The only thing that matters to me is you. You make me a better person. You remind me why I started all of this in the first place, before I got lost in the game of accumulation. Without you, none of it means anything. All the money, all the success, all the recognition, it's just empty numbers on a screen if I don't have someone to share it with, someone who sees me for who I really am, not what I have." Emma's defenses crumbled, and she wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest, letting the tears come finally. "I'm scared, Marcus. I'm scared that one day you'll wake up and realize you made a mistake, that you'll miss your old life, your old world, the ease of being with someone who understands all the unspoken rules and expectations. I'm scared that I'll never be enough, that I'll always be the girl who doesn't quite fit." "That will never happen," he whispered, holding her tightly, feeling her shake with suppressed sobs. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. You've shown me what's real, what matters.
I was successful before I met you, but I was also lonely and disconnected and slowly turning into someone I didn't recognize. You brought me back to life. You reminded me of who I wanted to be when I started this journey." As time went on, their love only grew stronger, deeper, more certain. Marcus began to step back from some of his business commitments, prioritizing time with Emma over deals and meetings that would have once consumed him entirely. He promoted trusted executives to handle day-to-day operations, delegating responsibilities he'd once thought only he could manage, freeing himself to focus on what he now realized was more important, what would matter when he looked back on his life. He found himself drawn to the simplicity of her world, the honesty and authenticity that had been missing from his life for so long. He started eating at the diner more than at expensive restaurants, preferring the honest food and genuine conversation to pretentious menus and performative dining.
Emma, too, changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. She started to see that wealth and success weren't inherently bad, that they could be tools for good if used wisely and with intention. With Marcus's encouragement and financial support, she enrolled in engineering courses at the community college, expanding her skills and knowledge beyond the practical mechanics she'd learned in the garage. She discovered a passion for automotive design, for innovation, for finding ways to make cars more efficient and environmentally friendly. She started drawing designs in notebooks, sketching out ideas for improvements, thinking beyond just fixing what was broken to imagining what could be better. She also began working with a nonprofit that provided free car repairs to low-income families, people who couldn't afford to keep their vehicles running but needed them desperately to get to work and take care of their families. She used her expertise to give back to her community in ways she'd always wanted to, but never had the resources to do on a larger scale. Marcus provided funding, equipment, and space, but Emma provided the vision and the hands-on work, training other mechanics to volunteer their time and skills. Their relationship became a true partnership, each of them bringing out the best in the other, complementing weaknesses and amplifying strengths. Marcus learned humility and gratitude, understanding that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in relationships and experiences and the positive impact you had on the world. He started a foundation focused on supporting small businesses and trade education, using his resources to create opportunities for people like Emma, who had skill and determination but lacked financial backing. He funded apprenticeship programs, provided loans to aspiring entrepreneurs, supported vocational schools that had been neglected by traditional funding sources. Emma gained confidence and ambition, realizing that her dreams didn't have to be small just because she came from modest circumstances. She could think bigger, reach higher, impact more lives, and still stay true to her values. She didn't have to choose between success and integrity, between ambition and authenticity. Together, they were unstoppable, a force that surprised everyone who doubted them. They complemented each other perfectly. Marcus's business acumen and resources combined with Emma's practical skills and community connections. They started initiatives that brought real change to the city, creating jobs where there had been unemployment, supporting education where schools had been failing, building infrastructure in underserved neighborhoods that had been forgotten by development. And through it all, their love deepened, becoming the foundation on which everything else was built, the bedrock that made all the rest possible. One rainy evening, exactly a year after the night they'd first met, Marcus took Emma back to the spot where his car had broken down. The street was empty, just as it had been that night, the rain falling steadily around them in a way that felt almost nostalgic. He'd arranged for the street to be closed for an hour, calling in favors and pulling strings to make it happen, wanting this moment to be perfect and private. "What are we doing here?" Emma asked, pulling her jacket tighter against the cold, her breath visible in the damp air. She looked around at the familiar intersection, recognition dawning. This is where we met. Marcus took her hand and led her to the center of the road, to the exact spot where his car had been stranded, where his life had changed without him realizing it in that moment. "This is where it all started," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is where you saved me." "I just fixed your car, Marcus," Emma smiled, but there was curiosity in her eyes, anticipation of what was coming. "No," he said, his voice serious, intense, full of all the feelings he'd been carrying for months. "You did so much more than that. You showed me what really matters. You reminded me that strength and worth aren't measured by money or power, but by character and kindness, and the willingness to help someone even when there's nothing in it for you. You changed my life, Emma. You made me remember who I used to be before the money, before the success, before I built walls around myself to keep everyone at a distance. You tore down those walls without even trying, just by being yourself." Emma's eyes filled with tears as Marcus dropped to one knee, the rain soaking through his expensive suit, ruining it in a way that he didn't care about at all. He pulled a small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a ring. He opened the box, revealing a simple yet elegant ring, a single diamond set in platinum, understated but beautiful, chosen specifically because it reminded him of Emma herself, genuine beauty without unnecessary embellishment. "Emma Torres, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving to you every single day that you're the most important thing in my world? Will you build a life with me, a real life based on what matters, not on what looks good from the outside?" Emma stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. She thought about everything they'd been through, the challenges and the doubts and the judgments from people on both sides. She thought about the moments of pure joy, the laughter and the deep conversations, and the feeling of being truly seen and valued. She thought about the man kneeling before her, vulnerable and open, and offering her his heart without reservation or condition. She thought about the life they could build together, combining their strengths, supporting each other's dreams, making a real difference in the world. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it." Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands shaking slightly, and stood, pulling her into his arms. They kissed in the middle of the empty street, the rain pouring down around them, just as it had the night they'd first met. But this time, instead of strangers helping each other in a moment of need, they were two people who had found in each other something neither had known they were searching for: love, real and transformative and utterly unexpected. The kind of love that changes everything, that makes you want to be better, that gives meaning to all the rest of it. Their wedding was a blend of both their worlds, a celebration that honored both of their backgrounds. It took place in a small garden that Emma had helped create in her neighborhood, surrounded by family and close friends from every part of their lives. Emma's father walked her down the aisle, tears streaming down his weathered face, proud and emotional, hardly able to believe his little girl was getting married. Marcus's colleagues were there, many of them seeing for the first time the depth of his love for Emma, understanding finally what he'd been trying to tell them, seeing that this wasn't a phase or a mistake, but something real and profound. Emma's friends from the neighborhood mixed with business executives and society figures, and to everyone's surprise, they got along beautifully, finding common ground in their genuine affection for the couple. It was a simple ceremony, No ice sculptures or champagne fountains or designer everything. Just honest emotion, filled with laughter and tears, a celebration of two people who had found each other against all odds and refused to let the world's expectations define what they could be together. As they stood together, hand in hand, exchanging vows they'd written themselves, Marcus looked at Emma and knew that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all his life. Not success, not power, not recognition or influence, but love. True, unconditional love that asked for nothing and gave everything. Love that made him want to be better, do better, live better. Love that saw his flaws and accepted them, that celebrated his strengths without inflating them, that made him feel like he could be completely himself without apology or pretense. And Emma, looking into Marcus's eyes as she spoke her vows, knew that she'd found her home. Not in a place, but in a person. Someone who saw her for who she truly was and loved her all the more for it, grease stains and all. Someone who believed in her dreams and supported her ambitions without trying to change her or mold her into someone she wasn't. Someone who had taught her that she deserved happiness, that her worth wasn't determined by where she came from, but by who she chose to be and how she chose to live.
Years later, they would look back on that rainy night and marvel at how a single moment had changed everything. How a broken car and a chance encounter had led to a love that neither of them had thought possible. They built a life together that exceeded anything either of them had imagined, filled with purpose and passion, using their combined strengths to make a real difference in the world around them. Marcus expanded his business to focus on sustainable technologies and affordable housing, projects that reflected the values Emma had instilled in him, that honored the communities that had been overlooked by traditional development. He sold off some of his more exploitative holdings, companies that prioritized profit over people, and invested instead in businesses that created real value for communities. He became known not just as a billionaire, but as a philanthropist with genuine commitment to change, someone who didn't just write checks, but rolled up his sleeves and got involved in the work. Emma opened a chain of community garages across the city, providing training and employment to young people who, like her, had grown up with little but possessed the determination to build something better. She created apprenticeship programs that offered real pathways to careers, partnered with schools to offer vocational education that had been cut from budgets, and became an advocate for skilled trades as viable, valuable career paths. Her garages became known for fair prices and quality work, but also for the opportunities they provided to people who'd been written off by society. Young people who'd been told they weren't college material, who'd been dismissed as having no potential, found purpose and success under her guidance. Together, they proved that love could bridge any divide, that two people from completely different worlds could find common ground and create something beautiful together. Their story became a testament to the power of kindness, the importance of humility, the belief that true wealth is measured not by what you own, but by who you love and how you choose to live. They showed that you didn't have to choose between success and integrity, that you could have both if you stayed true to your values.
They had 2 children, a daughter who inherited Emma's practical nature and love of fixing things, who at age 5 could name every part of an engine and preferred toy cars to dolls, and a son who had Marcus's head for business but Emma's heart for service, who organized fundraisers for his school at age 7 and dreamed of starting companies that solved real problems. They raised their children to understand that privilege came with responsibility, that having resources meant using them to help others, that character mattered more than status. And on rainy nights, when the storm rolled across the city and the streets shimmered with reflected light, Marcus and Emma would stand by their window, holding each other close, grateful for the chance encounter that had brought them together. They'd watch the rain and remember that night, remember how lost Marcus had been even though he had everything. Remember how Emma had stopped to help a stranger without expecting anything in return. The billionaire who had everything learned that he had nothing until he met the mechanic's daughter who had nothing but gave him everything. And in that truth, they found not just love, but a life worth living, a purpose worth pursuing, and a partnership that transformed not just themselves, but everyone around them. They learned that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or sold, that real connection transcends social boundaries, that love, when it's real, can change everything.